Mridanga Badya Sunite Mana Avasara Sadajache Gaurabhita Kirtana Suni Anande Hridaya Nache Jugala Murti Dekhiya Mora Parama Ananda Hoya Prasada Seva Korite Hoya Sakala Prapancha Jaya Jedina Grihe Bhajana Dekhi Grihete Goloka Bhaya Charana Sedu Dekhiya Ganga Sukana Simana Paya Tulasi Dekhi Juraya Prana Madhava Toshani Jani Gora Priya Saka Sebane Givana Sarta Kamani Bhakati Bino Krishna Bhajane Anukula Payaja Pati Divase Paramasukhe Shikara Koroyeta Suddha Bhakata Charana Renu Bhajana Anukula Bhakata Seva Paramasudi Premalati Koro Mula Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dust from the lotus feet of pure devotees is conducive to devotional service, while service to the Vaishnavas is itself the supreme perfection and the root of the tender creeper of divine love. I observe with great care the holy days like Ekadasi and Janmashtami, for they are the mother of devotion. As my dwelling place, I choose with the greatest of reverence and love the transcendental abode of Sri Krishna. All those places where my Lord Gaurasundar traveled for pastimes, I will visit in the company of loving devotees. My mind always begs for the opportunity to hear the music of the mridanga. Upon hearing the kind of kirtan ordained by Lord Gaurachandra, my heart dances in ecstasy. By beholding the deity forms of the divine couple, Sri Radha Krishna, I feel the greatest joy. By honoring the Lord's prasad, I conquer over all worldly illusions. Goloka Vrindavan appears in my home whenever I see the worship and service of Lord Hari going on there. Upon seeing the Ganges, which is a river of nectar emanating from the lotus feet of the Lord, my happiness knows no bounds. The sight of the holy tulsi tree soothes my soul, for I know she gives pleasure to Lord Krishna. By honoring Sak, a dear favorite of Lord Chaitanya, I consider life worthwhile. Whatever Bhaktivinoda obtains that is conducive for the service of Sri Krishna, he accepts every day with the greatest of joy. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari. Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Jasodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Prabhupada 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 Sri Gaurnitai ki jai, Sri Radha Madan Mohan ki jai, Sri Jagannath Subhadra Baladev ki jai. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanasalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namah Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Jutapadakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavanscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vidantam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Visakam Vitansya He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sudhe Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha Kalpatarubhasya Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Hare Krishna. Yes, Prabhupada ki jai. Today we are reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamritam, and this is the volume 3, entitled Only He Could Lead Them, San Francisco and India, 1967. A biography of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, written by Satsvarup Das Goswami. This chapter is entitled New Jagannath Puri. This is chapter 3 of the book. In the original Vedic society of ancient India, brahmachari life began at the age of 5. Parents would send their son to live with the guru at the Gurukul, where the boy would receive basic education, spiritual instruction, and strict moral discipline under the guru. Even Lord Krishna, in his transcendental pastimes on earth, had attended the Gurukul and very humbly served his spiritual master. The basic principle of brahmachari life was celibacy. By practicing celibacy, the brahmachari would develop great powers of memory and sensory control. And if such a trained brahmachari later decided to take a wife, his sex life would be regulated, not licentious. But although brahmachari life was necessary for healthy society, Prabhupada had seen within his own lifetime the rapid deterioration of brahmacharya almost to non-existence. And in America, the situation was, of course, much worse. Srimad Bhagavatam tells of a young Brahmana, Ajamil, who fell from spiritual life because he had seen a drunken man embracing a half-naked prostitute. In America, to see a half-naked prostitute in public was not uncommon. As soon as a brahmachari walked out on the street, he would confront so many allurements. But Prabhupada was convinced that brahmacharis could protect themselves even in America if they regularly chanted Hare Krishna and sincerely tried to follow the rules and regulations. Krishna would protect them. Prabhupada had decided to ask Upendra to come and live with him as his personal servant. Prabhupada's former servant, Ranchor, had recently left his position. Although supposedly a brahmachari, he had never been a serious brahmachari. He had even seduced one of the young women devotees in New York. Prabhupada had found out and had asked the girl why she had indulged in sex with Ranchor if she was not planning to marry him. Prabhupada's wife had so disarmed the girl that she had been unable to answer. Prabhupada had admonished her, "You girls should not make yourselves so cheap," and had given Ranchor another chance. But Ranchor never became serious. After playing the drums during the big kirtan at the Avalon Ballroom, Ranchor had become fascinated with the dance hall. He would sneak out from his service, lie to Prabhupada about his absence, and go looking for girls at the Avalon. One day, he never returned. As one of the devotees reported to Prabhupada, he just disappeared into the strobe lights. Ranchor did come back once to ask Prabhupada for money so that he could return to his home in New York. Upendra, despite his weaknesses, was spontaneously attracted to Prabhupada and liked to be with him whenever he could. Sometimes Upendra would go up to the apartment with one or two other devotees and just sit in front of Prabhupada as Prabhupada sat on a tin pillow behind his low desk. Sometimes Prabhupada would continue reading or writing, and Upendra would sit and bask in his presence, simply watching him work. After 10 minutes or so, Prabhupada would look up and say, "All right, that is enough." And the boys would bow and leave. Upendra would also go to see Prabhupada taking his lunch. And Prabhupada would take some rice and vegetables from his plate, put them on a chapati, and offer them to Upendra. Although the prasadam was similar to the prasadam the devotees are downstairs, Upendra thought that it tasted much better. One day, when Upendra was alone with Prabhupada in his room, Prabhupada asked, "You are living with a young girl and people who take intoxicants?" For the second time, Upendra was convinced that Swamiji could read his mind and knew his entire life. "Yes," Upendra admitted, "but I'm not having..." Prabhupada interrupted, "That is not good. Swamiji, I'm not having any sexual connections. Where there is a boy and where there is a girl," Prabhupada said, "there is sex. You must come and live with me." Upendra was delighted. "Yes, I'll come immediately." He took a few belongings from his apartment, left everything else with his girlfriend, and moved into the front room of Prabhupada's apartment. He was now Swamiji's personal servant. Prabhupada requested him to keep his job at the post office. Around midnight, as soon as Upendra got off work, he would return to the apartment. Prabhupada always left the door unlocked for him. Usually, soon after Upendra locked the door, crawled into his sleeping bag, and fell asleep, he would be awakened by Prabhupada speaking into his dictating machine, composing teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Upendra would nod off again and sleep until 6. Upendra relished this close association with his spiritual master and became always cheerful. "I just want to be Swamiji's dog," he would often tell the other devotees. One time, Upendra was reading to himself from Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote from Srimad Bhagavatam: "The whole subject matter is so presented through the lips of Srila Sukadeva Goswami that any sincere audience who will lend his ears submissively to this message of the transcendental world will at once relish the transcendental mellows distinguished from the perverted mellows of the material world. The ripened fruit is not dropped all of a sudden from the highest planet of Krishna Loka, but it has come down carefully, being handled by the chain of disciplic succession, without any change or disturbance in the formation of the soft and ripened fruit." "You don't have any questions?" Prabhupada asked. Upendra looked up from the book. "No, Swamiji, I accept everything you say." Prabhupada began rocking strongly in his rocking chair and smiled as Upendra kept reading. Then Prabhupada taught Upendra the proper way to hold a book while reading, with the palms of both hands up and half the lap. This advice gave Upendra greater enthusiasm to please his spiritual master by reading his books. Upendra was still bothered by sexual desires. He thought that maybe he should get married, but he was confused about what a Krishna-conscious marriage was supposed to be. "How could you be married," he puzzled, "if you don't love the girl you want to marry? And how could you love her without having sex with her?" He wanted to ask Swamiji about this, but he kept it to himself, waiting for an opportunity and for the courage. Then one day he entered Prabhupada's room as Prabhupada paced back and forth from one end of the room with its 3 large bay windows overlooking Frederick Street to the other end, where his rocking chair sat. Now Upendra decided he could ask his question. "Swamiji," he began, "may I ask a question?" "Yes," Srila Prabhupada replied, stopping his pacing. "If a boy is separate from a girl, then how can he learn to love her?" Prabhupada began to walk back and forth again, chanting on his beads. After a moment, he turned and said softly, "Love. Love is for Krishna." And he walked towards the window and looked down at the street below. "You want a girl? Pick one." He pointed towards some woman passing on the street. "There is no love in this material world," he said. "Love is for Krishna." Gradually, under Srila Prabhupada's pure influence, Upendra began to feel less agitated by sexual demands. He came to understand that he was not a material body, but a spiritual soul, that the soul's eternal nature was to love Krishna, and that for a pure devotee, for Swamiji, love was for Krishna. More and more, Upendra just wanted to be the servant of Swamiji. He thought of what foods to buy for him and how to make things comfortable for him. It was in this mood of wanting to serve Swamiji that Upendra visited a psychedelic shop one day. He had heard they had recently received some prints from India. So he went in and browsed through the prints, picked out some pictures of Lord Krishna, and took them to Swamiji. In Prabhupada's room, along with other devotees, Upendra unrolled the prints one by one on Prabhupada's desk, waiting to see Prabhupada's response. As Upendra watched, It seemed to him that Swamiji was looking at photos of his personal friend. He was pleased with the pictures. Hayagriva commented that the religious art of the Indian prince was a bit garish, but Prabhupada explained that the technique did not matter. The important thing was that the pictures were of Krishna and were executing according to Vedic descriptions. For the devotee, they were beautiful. They were non-different from Krishna. Prabhupada selected as his favorite a picture of Lord Krishna standing and playing his flute in the moonlight, the river Yamuna flowing by. In this picture, Krishna was known as Govinda. Prabhupada held the picture up and quoted a verse, Smeram bhangitraya parichitam sachivistirna drishtim vamsi nyastadara kisalayam ujjalam chandrakena Govindakhyam haritanumita kesitirto pakante ma prekshitas Sakhe bandhu sange stirangaha. He then took a sheet of paper and began writing. While the devotees watched him intently, listening to the scratching of the pen on the page. Then he read aloud, My dear friend, if you still have an inclination to enjoy material life, society, friendship, and love, then please do not see the boy named Govinda, who is standing in a tree-curved way, smiling and skillfully playing on his flute, his lips brightened by the full moonshine. Yamuna, you can write this nicely? Prabhupada knew that Yamuna was a trained calligrapher. He asked her to print the verse and display it, along with a picture, by his sitting place in the temple. He wanted to be able to look at it during kirtans. Upendra thought and prayed, if I can just fix myself steadily in serving Swamiji, who has so much love for Krishna, then I too will become transcendental. He felt that since it was not possible for him to see Govinda the way Swamiji saw him, he should serve Swamiji, the pure devotee of Govinda, and in that way become pure. I just want to become Swamiji's dog, Upendra said as he left the apartment. In New York, the boys had their orders from Prabhupada not to give any more money to Mr. Price unless there was a purchase contract. Mr. Price's story was earlier described, how he was wanting to sell some property in New York to establish a temple, but he had also a cheating mentality. So Prabhupada still wanted the building. He had written to Brahmananda on March 4th. I hope when I go to New York next, I shall enter the new house forthwith. And he had written Hare Ram on March 7th. I am very glad to learn that Brahmananda, yourself and all others, have the transcendental courage to take all risks for Krishna, and this act will enhance your glory in Krishna consciousness. But he wanted them not to be cheated by false promises. Meanwhile, Mr. Price was asking the devotees to turn over $5,000 to his financial friend, Mr. Hall, who would then add $20,000 and make the down payment to the owner, Mr. Tyler. Mr. Price wanted Brahmananda to get the point across to His Excellency that negotiations had to be done in this fashion and right away if they seriously wanted to get the house. His Excellency means Srila Prabhupada. Mr. Price was calling Prabhupada His Excellency. Brahmananda wrote to Prabhupada asking him to advise the bank to transfer $5,000 into the account controlled by the boys, the trustees of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Prabhupada gave permission and asked that the check be signed by the president and secretary because Brahmananda and Satswarup are the main support for purchasing this house. And Kirtanananda is a supplement to this from his kitchen department. But he said that the check should be made to the seller, Mr. Tyler, not to the financier, Mr. Hall. The money and the society is yours, Srila Prabhupada acknowledged. You can spend in any way, but it is my duty to give you advice as ever well-wisher. Then Mr. Price invited Brahmananda to meet Mr. Hall, and he suggested that Brahmananda come prepared with a check for $5,000. On the way, Mr. Price explained that Mr. Hall was perhaps the biggest real estate dealer in Manhattan, a multi-millionaire. He owned skyscrapers. Everything he owned was big. When Brahmananda entered Mr. Hall's office, he thought it was right out of a Hollywood movie, a conference room 10 times bigger than the 2nd Avenue Temple room. And seated at the head of the large oval table was Mr. Hall himself. The room was in semi-darkness with a few spotlights on Mr. Hall, who sat before a battery of telephones. Even as they began to discuss, Mr. Hall paused several times, picking up phones and talking to persons in various places across the country. Young man, Mr. Hall said to Brahmananda, we are helping you get a house. It's a beautiful house, a New York City landmark. Then Mr. Hall's girlfriend called from a boat in the Caribbean. He talked to her for a while and then returned to Brahmananda and Mr. Price, who sat in the shadows at his conference table. Mr. Hall had a big contract he wanted Brahmananda to sign. Brahmananda knew that Swamiji wanted a contract, and here it was. He also knew that if he signed over the $5,000, he would have no other money and no extra income. And he knew they knew it. But Swamiji wanted the building. Swamiji himself had looked at $1 lakh buildings and had offered to buy them, even though he had very little money to back his offers up. And Brahmananda always did whatever Swamiji said. To sign this contract, Brahmananda concluded, was an act of faith in Swamiji and Krishna. He did not analytically ask, where will the rest of the money come from? To do so, he thought, would be like doubting Swamiji. So here he was in this big-time financials office. It was awesome. The millionaires were going to help. Mr. Price was at Brahmananda's elbow. Mr. Hall was telling Brahmananda that everything was all right. We are going to get you this house. Now it was actually going to happen. Here was one of the biggest men in Manhattan offering to help. And whereas Brahmananda had no money, Mr. Hall would be able to pick up the place very easily from the owner. Glancing quickly over the contract, Brahmananda signed. It was a deal, and he gave them the check for $5,000. As soon as Brahmananda and Mr. Price left Mr. Hall's office, there was a distinct change in Mr. Price. Although still acting as Brahmananda's friend, he now said, Gee, now you have to get this money. As they walked together on the uptown streets, Mr. Price cheerfully pushed the whole thing onto Brahmananda. That was a change. Before, Mr. Price had been saying that he and Mr. Hall were going to do it. But now he said that it was all up to the devotees. Brahmananda asked about the legal position. Mr. Price explained that only the Krishna Society was bound. But what about the promises? What about Mr. Hall's being so rich and wanting to help them, and Mr. Price's wanting to help? Mr. Price assured Brahmananda that he and Mr. Hall did want to help. They were doing everything they could. But Brahmananda and the other devotees should also do everything they could and come up with the $20,000 to complete the down payment by the end of the month. And what if they could not? Mr. Price made it very clear. If you don't pay the balance in a month, then you lose your deposit. By the time Brahmananda reached 26 2nd Avenue, he realized that he had been cheated. He was crushed. He turned to the other devotees and told them what had happened, but they could only return, "Why did you do it?" Brahmananda phoned Srila Prabhupada in San Francisco. Now that his eyes had been opened about Mr. Price, Brahmananda was blunt about his mistake, and he told Prabhupada that he had given away the $5,000. "All of it is gone?" Srila Prabhupada asked. "Yes," Brahmananda replied. He heard Prabhupada hang up the phone. Brahmananda had been about to explain the whole thing, but Swamiji had just hung up without a word. Brahmananda placed the receiver back on the hook. He was shaken. The next day, the trustees held a special meeting. The boys sat around in the front room of Prabhupada's apartment, trying to decide what to do. Gargamuni again called Prabhupada, who advised them to stop the check at the bank. Swamiji is as smart as a fox. Ram smiled. Gargamuni phoned the bank, but it was too late. The check had already been cashed. They consulted Mr. Goldsmith, their friendly lawyer. He said it sounded like a weak legal case. Price and Hall had not legally bound themselves to pay anything if the devotees failed to pay. And if the devotees couldn't pay the $20,000 balance by the end of the month, they would lose their $5,000 deposit. They could sue for fraud, but court fees would be costly. Then, one by one, Brahmananda, Satswarup, Kirtanananda, Rairam, Gargamuni, and the others began to look at the letters from Prabhupada and discuss how he had warned them to avoid being cheated. Their greatest blunder, they began to realize, was disobeying his instructions. He had told them not to trust the promises of these businessmen, and he had told them that the check should be made only to the owner, not to the financier. Within a few days, further instructions from their spiritual master came in the mail. They were admonishments, but hearing from him, even if he was chastising them, was better than the pain of his hanging up the phone without a word. "But you have not followed my instructions, and now you are in trouble," he wrote to the boys. He wrote Rairam, except from his letter, "You are all foolish boys. I repeatedly warned you, even at the last point, that we should not pay the check unless there was agreement between Mr. Tyler and Mr. Hall. The agreement was signed like a marriage ceremony without the presence of the bridegroom. The mistake was there, and now you are repenting." End of quote. To Satswarup, he wrote, quote from his letter, You have asked me whether the San Francisco branch will pay some money for purchasing the house. But where is your house? And where is the purchase? So far, it is talks of Mr. Price and Company in which you innocent boys have been entrapped. I do not know how I can help you in your great blunder. I can only hope that Krishna will help you. End of quote. Unlike the boys and their lawyers, Prabhupada thought that the legal case against the businessman would be a strong one. Quote from his letter. I am not a lawyer, but this is a common sense affair. Mr. Hall has taken the money, and he must finance to purchase the house. If he has no money to finance, then it is a cheating case, clear and simple. End of quote. The culprits, he said, should be brought to criminal court. Their conspiracy and fraud were obvious and could be proven. Quote from the letter. From the telephonic conversation of Brahmananda, it appears to be an organized cheating case, and you have to face with courage without excusing any one of them. We are not revengeful, but we cannot lose Krishna's money for nothing. End of quote. The boys had already blundered so much that Prabhupada doubted whether they could tackle the cheaters. But he said they had to try. Let us have the house or return back the money. In default, there is clear case of cheating. Now you can do as you like. Srila Prabhupada wrote the boy's lawyer, relating the history of the case. He also wrote a letter to the financier, the owner, and Mr. Price, threatening to expose everything, including what he alone has seen, that the lawyers involved were also implicated. Brahmananda could barely understand what was going on, but it appeared that Swamiji was going to get results. The boys were fools, certainly, but the businessmen were certainly cheaters. And Swamiji claimed that he could prove it in court. So we can end this reading here. Srila Prabhupada Lilamritam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Any questions, comments? Hare Krishna.